I'd like to start by thanking you for the opportunity to speak today. The weeks since receiving the Milken Educator Award have been a blur, but what has been most exciting has been the opportunity to connect with outstanding educators across the state and also opportunities like these. I was asked to speak today on the innovative strategies I use to foster student achievement. I considered sharing about the Socratic discussions in which my students engage, their analysis of primary sources and argumentative essays, or the ways I leverage technology to encourage students to reflect on their own learning. These strategies are the pillars of my AP United States History course, and they have no doubt fostered student achievement in the traditional sense. Over 90% of my students earn college credit for US history, either through successful completion of the AP exam or through concurrent enrollment with our collegiate partners. But ultimately today, I would like for you to consider a different form of student achievement, a slightly different definition of student success, and one that demonstrates why education in history and the humanities is so important. A 2020 Pew Research study found that nearly 80% of voters reported that they have just a few or zero close friends who identify with a political party other than their own. That number was 15 percentage points higher than just 4 years earlier in 2016. A 2022 study indicates that intense political antagonism has nearly tripled since 1994. It is abundantly clear that especially when it comes to politics, we are having a harder and harder time understanding each other. I submit to you that the solution or a solution to that problem is the history classroom. Despite the politically driven attention that my discipline has recently received, a good history education doesn't teach students what to think, it teaches them how to think. It teaches them, my colleagues in this profession do this by examining multiple perspectives, by challenging biases, and by developing evidence-based reasoning skills in our students. It's nearly cliche in my line of work that strong social studies education is critical to the survival of the Republic because we must produce thoughtful, engaged, and informed voters. But the humanities may also cure our social ills as it relates to partisanship and political polarization. Because history in particular provides students the opportunity to practice a social and emotional skill that we seem to be increasingly lacking: empathy. It is common practice for historians and students of history to make judgments and evaluations about people of the past and the decisions they made. In my class, we debate whether Andrew Jackson helped or hindered American democracy, whether Lincoln deserves the nickname the Great Emancipator, or whether Woodrow Wilson was ahead of his time or simply lost in his own idealism. But what I must constantly remind my students is these people of the past, they're not here to defend themselves. And that gives the historian and students of history incredible power and, accordingly, incredible responsibility. Employing historical empathy requires that we consider the people of the past in context, that we consider the information available to them and the gravity of the choices they made. And when done well, historical empathy is the key to unlocking a nuanced understanding of history. For example, historical empathy helps us to understand why a poor farmer in Tennessee, with no connection whatsoever to the institution of slavery, might take up arms for the Confederacy in 1861. It helps us to understand why Booker T. Washington, the leading voice for African Americans in the late 1800s, would actually suggest that black folks accept segregation. It helps us to see why borderline alcoholic lawmakers of the 1920s would put their stamp of approval on a prohibition amendment that was doomed to fail. Of course, historical empathy itself is not new or innovative. Historians are trained to employ it every day. And while it does excite me when my students unlock this deeper, more nuanced understanding of the past, it's not lost on me that most of my students are not bound for a career in history. No, the real measure of success here is how this practice carries over to students' interactions with one another and with their community. Because the historical arena provides us with a safe practicing ground for the development of this habit of mind, one separated by decades from the volatile political landscape of today. So if a conservative student can better empathize with Eastern European immigrants of the late 1800s, perhaps they will also better empathize with their classmate, a first-generation immigrant from the Middle East or Latin America. If a liberal student can empathize with conservative opponents to FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, perhaps they will also empathize with their neighbor who flies a Trump flag on their home. If history students in red states and blue states learn to empathize with one another, to consider the experiences and circumstances that shape each other's views, perhaps they will be kinder to one another online and in person. If the study of American history has taught me anything, it's that we will never agree on policy or politics, nor should we. Competing ideology is what has always pushed our nation forward. But in order for that competition to be healthy and productive, we cannot vilify our opponents. We have to seek to understand them. And that's what teaching historical empathy allows us to do. And that, far more than high test scores, is my greatest hope for my students. I welcome your questions.